Now this is important because we don't necessarily know what causes mild intellectual disability. We know, and there's plenty of good genetic research that's surfaced in the past 10 or 15 years that helps to explain moderate, severe, and profound mental retardation. So in the examples here, we have stereotypical, prototypical features of Down syndrome, fetal alcohol syndrome. This is microencephalitis, or Angelman's syndrome. If you look online, it's intriguing. They have images of the distinct facial features that are associated with these disorders. So not only is there a genetic influence, or is there an understanding at the genetic level, but also at the manifestation, physical manifestation of these disorders. So again, the genetic or environmental causes, certainly with fetal alcohol syndrome, are known. We can say, oh, I know why they are at the moderate, severe, and profound level. However, when we move to mild, the biggest group, these kids don't look any different. These kids might not act any different, but man, when you score those tests, you say, wow, compared to their peers, they haven't accumulated as much knowledge. They don't have as well-developed reasoning skills. So across our lives, our intelligence, if you will, develops over time as we incorporate more and more skills. Picking things up, writing, talking, etc. It's about skill accumulation. And we apply our understanding of the measurement of ability to this skill accumulation. So over time, we anticipate that we're going to interact with the environment in a way that saves skills, stuff on our hard drive. Some kids save a lot less stuff on their hard drive than others over time. That's why we see low intellectual ability scores at the overall level. So again, most children with ID fall in the mild range. And the genetic or environmental causes have been identified for only a small fraction of this group. We're not sure what causes it. Now we know, though, from these epidemiological studies, they're likely to be boys. They're likely to be from racial or ethnic minority groups, especially African Americans. So African American boys are very commonly identified as having ID. And if you throw in low socioeconomic status, that constitutes the major risk factors. Our assumption is, if it's not due to some genetic or environmental influence, we can identify that it must be due to, this is the technical term, cultural, familial factors, which might be genetic, at least partially genetic. Most everything is, right? At least partially genetic. Or due to lack of early enriching experiences. Poverty is associated with mothers' social and personal vulnerabilities and impoverished home environment. This is why we support Head Start, and we support mandatory kindergartens in states, right? We're also seeing referral patterns being a problem here too. Some would say this might be the cause of overrepresentation or disproportionality. That boys act up a lot more than girls, and maybe there is something latent within all of us that leads to discrimination against those who are from low SES backgrounds, or who have children who have parents who aren't engaged, or maybe it's some latent racism of some sort. There are many potential reasons here. But the point is, 85% of kids with ID are going to probably show these criteria. And we don't know if we should call something that's due to experience or lack of experience a disorder. Makes us feel kind of awkward. And we are encouraged to engage in non-discriminatory assessment, and we're encouraged to, in some ways, rule out the cause of learning and intellectual disabilities due to lack of environmental enrichment, or in some ways poverty, etc. So we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. So recently the AAIDD, the American Association of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, in this little green book said that we've got to keep it simple and focus on psychometric G. So intellectual functioning is currently best conceptualized and captured by a general factor of intelligence. It goes on and said that the IQ score should be approximately 2 standard deviations below the mean. That's what we've been doing. But look, it says this: a single dimension of intelligence continues to garner the most support within the scientific community. And the position of AAIDD is that intellectual functioning is best conceptualized and captured by a general factor. What I didn't highlight, and I should have, and I really meant to, was this statement. Until such measures of multiple intelligences can be assessed reliably and validly, it's the position of the AID to focus on psychometric G. Now, the problem with that statement is many would claim that, and I think this is true, that the specific abilities can be measured reliably and validly. They should have chosen better wording than that. But they're right in a way. So when we move to part scores, these measures of the specific abilities in composites, there's a long history of using them when they don't converge. Well, we should not trust the full-scale IQ. We should invalidate it. We should say that it's not meaningful, that it's not unitary. There are all kinds of words to vilify that IQ. Recent research by Watkins and others have shown that no matter what the profile looks like, the validity and predictive nature of the IQ isn't undermined at all. But we've done this in the past for pragmatic reasons for learning disabilities, right? We've said, oh, okay, the IQ is too low, but I need to qualify. I need 16 points. I need 23 points. So I'm going to say that it's not valid, and I'm going to use the higher of the profile scores. We've done it pragmatically, but there's really little scientific support for it. And if we jettison the IQ achievement discrepancy, maybe we can go back to better, more empirically supported recommendations. The Social Security Administration and their guidelines for assessing mental retardation focused on part scores, but they said that the low part scores could be used in the diagnosis. So just the opposite of what we see. In our survey of states, criteria for mental retardation at the time in the mid-2000s, we showed that some states required emphasis, required focus on the part scores rather than the full-scale IQ. Especially nonverbal part scores. A few of them, not all. Most of them are focusing on the full-scale IQ. So again, it supports my idea that there's a consensus model of ID, focusing on the full-scale IQ. So the previous research with part scores, meaning subtest scores or composites, has shown that children with intellectual disabilities have normative weaknesses across all the abilities measured, a flat profile. There's less variation than what you would see in the general population. And there is an inverse relation between the subtest G loading and the group's performance, meaning low G loading, low correlation with G, closer to the mean. Higher correlation with G, farther away from the mean. So we studied how this would play out with the Woodcock-Johnson. We were funded by the Woodcock-Munoz Foundation, and we tested 30 children with mental retardation, mild mental retardation, based on good, comprehensive assessments. Most were African-American children from the Memphis City schools and surrounding area. Full age range as well. And here's what the group profile looked like. Just as we might expect, most of the part scores, the 7 CHC factor clusters, are below 70. But 2 of them are above. Now this is on average. These are mean scores. You can see the means here. Here are the standard deviations, here are the ranges. And in visual processing, auditory processing, these served as outliers in the model. They have relatively low G loadings, as we showed in the previous model. Now, processing speed didn't show up like we expected, but we'll at least have partial support for the G loading explanation. Now, the IQ that stemmed from all of these subtests had a mean of 54. Again, the means are here in the lower 60s on average. And the range was 28 to 77. However, we have some ranges here of 37 to 100, 20 to 86, 50 to 79. We're like, whoa, maybe none of these kids have mental retardation. But we're not considering error, we're not considering the specific abilities and so forth. So when we start looking at the part scores, we start seeing findings that are very incongruent with the overall IQ. And I'll show you how this plays out with other studies too. We also calculated a similarity coefficient. We compared each individual's CHC factor cluster profile with that of the group. So each individual is compared to this model in terms of highs and lows. And what we're looking for is a match of individuals to the group profile. Most of the research in this area has shown that individuals never match the group profile. And we showed that 3 out of 30, 1 out of 10 matched the group profile. The rest of the kids were just all over the place. So the group profile is a really poor standard to compare individuals. I guess I can offer the maxim, don't ever do it. It says on average, but if a kid doesn't match the profile, it doesn't mean they don't have the disorder. So again, keep it simple, scholar. So about half demonstrated dissimilarity of the group profile. This tells us to be very cautious about profile interpretation. Here are examples of 10 cases from this study. Again, they all have very low IQs, that's below 70. Some have low 70s in the low range. But look at this variation just in this profile. 2 average scores, but an overall score in the low 70s. You have another average score in auditory processing, but an overall score below 70. Lots and lots of variation. We'd expect on the group profile, right, almost all the scores would be VL, and we'd have a couple maybe of Ls. But just of the 10, we're seeing lots of variation. And some, where I have pluses, had relative strengths or relative weaknesses from an ipsative analysis. So we examined the WISC factor indices. I want you to see the internal consistency there and the G loading. I've used color coding. If it's red, it has a high G loading. If it's yellow, it has a medium G loading. If it has a low G loading, it's in blue. Here's what our group profile looks like with 56 kids. The lowest G loading subtest at the group level was processing speed, and it produces the outlier in the model at the group level. The others are below 70 on average. But what I've done here is plotted the standard deviation of scores for this sample. Some kids are going to have high scores, some kids are going to have low scores. You can see how they're not going to fit the group profile. So the correlation between the means here and the G loading is pretty high. It's the only sample in which we found that, though. We did the same thing with the KBC. Many of you use the KBC. It produces 5 composites measuring specific abilities. I've color-coded them here. Again, red, high G loading, orange, medium, and blue, low. Short-term memory is the outlier here with the G loading of 0.49, which has about a 25% variance component. And we're seeing not a perfectly flat profile. For some reason, visual processing is producing the lowest score, and long-term storage retrieval is producing the highest, but we're seeing tons and tons of variation. So it doesn't quite fit our model that the G loadings are perfect examples, at least with this Spearman row. Works with the WISC model, which we predicate a lot of our knowledge in school psych on, but it doesn't work with the KBC model. But we're seeing, again, standard deviations that approximate the population or a little bit less. Lots of variation. I want to get to that. And we did the same thing with the DAS, which I've shown you a few moments ago. You can see the 4 have high G loadings and the processing speed is an outlier. And we see something really positive in a way, these all producing low scores for this group, but processing speed being the outlier. But still, its mean is below 70. But the standard deviation, look, is 17. So you can see it's a huge range, above below 34 points above and below one standard deviation. And it was a perfectly nil correlation with the G loadings here. So it's not as good of a guide as what we thought. It's more complex than that. So we examined the profile similarity between the individuals and the group. And we showed that less than 5% across these samples match the group profile. The individuals aren't showing up, their profiles don't look like the mean profile, the group profile. It's a poor model overall. Now, we calculated the percentage of individuals that had composite scores in the average range. That's 90 or above. And look, these are samples of kids with mental retardation, cognitive disability. 37%, 7%, 17, 16. Some of this is happening by chance or by training, by intensive intervention perhaps. If we look at the low range or higher, low average range, that's 80 or above. Look at this, almost 50% or more in most cases. An outlier is going to be the rule, not the exception. Now, I've been contacted since our first publication of the study with the WJ saying, you got to help us in our district because people are implementing policies saying that if a child has a part score measuring a specific ability above a certain number, above 70, above 75, above 80, we're disqualifying them. We're saying they're not eligible for services. Even though their IQ is below 70, even though all the adaptives show up as indicating impairment, we're saying, well, how can you have this strength and still be MR? Well, there are a number of reasons for that. If we applied those criteria, if there was any composite score above 70, they would be disqualified in this model. This shows you how it plays out. 80% would not qualify, 70, 60. When we moved to above 75, or equal to 75. About 2/3 or more than half. If we say 80 or above, that's pretty high. That's a 1/3 standard deviation below the mean, and 10 whole points above the 70. Still, we have very high numbers. When we look at the profiles, they mislead us. It's like a mirage in many ways. So the kid is functioning lower than more than 98% of individuals their age in general ability. That indicates that they need intensive services, and they may need them for a very long period into adulthood. But we're saying because they just happen to have a strength that may be due to training, special education programs, tutoring at home, just because they're good at putting puzzles together, or they've got good knowledge about the culture and of words, that they don't have the disorder. What's the consensus definition? It says low IQ, adaptive behavior, and onset during the developmental period. So in some ways, again, this greater focus on theory hurts us and probably hurts lots of kids. We either don't qualify them or we put them in a category where they probably don't belong based on their characteristics. I don't know if it always plays out this way, but I think it might in some cases. So it tells us that we've got to be more cautious in examining the profiles. And I guess what we're saying is, no matter what the profile looks like, if this is a valid administration, if you can go to court and say, I did everything right, they responded appropriately, they were fully motivated, this is good, that full-scale IQ sticks. And that's what should be used in determining eligibility. Part of the reason we see the profile variation is also regression toward the mean and combinatorial probabilities. When you score low on so many subtests, that's why the full-scale IQ isn't equal to the average of the subtest scores or the part scores. I did this analysis on my own. If all the WISC-IV factor indices were 70, just 70, the full-scale IQ would be 62. If you apply the rule that the IQ should be below 70 and all the part scores should be below 70, you just introduced new criteria for the disorder saying that the full-scale IQ has to be a 62 or lower. You've lowered it by another half standard deviation. So if you want to enact those criteria to decrease overrepresentation or strive for social justice, do it. But you know you're on your own.